In this video, I'm going to show you the game between Andy Woodward and Magnus Carlsen from round 6 of the Sigeman Cup. So before we get into the game analysis, let's take a look at the standings after 5 rounds. Remember, this is a 7-round all play all. It's a short sprint, so we're really getting to the business end of the tournament. So here we go, standings after round 5. So in the lead, Erigaisi and Adomush with 3.5. Then we've got Abdusatorov and Carlsen on 3. Now Carlsen has pulled himself up. He won against Zhu in the previous round. He had to fight very hard for that. It was a very tricky game. So those are the leading scores. So Carlsen in with a chance again. But of course, he knew he really had to go for a win against Woodward, who's having a pretty good tournament. 2.5 out of 5. 16 years old. A really hard worker, very talented. So this was going to be an interesting test for Magnus Carlsen, particularly as he was playing with black. Let's take a look and see what happens. Woodward opened with 1d4, and I think it's unlikely we're going to see like a solid Queen's Gambit from Magnus Carlsen. Indeed, he plays the King's Indian. We've seen him play the Benoni earlier in the tournament against Grandelius, but another fianchetto, and it just keeps more tension in the position. Now Woodward plays this very aggressive system, bishop e3. Notice he hasn't developed the knight yet, which means that he still has the option to advance on the king side with g4 and maybe h4 as well. Now Carlsen goes a5, so he doesn't lock the centre straight away. If you play e5, then white might just lock the position and then go for g4 and h4, h5. But this keeps, it's a very flexible move. So for example, if white goes for g4 now, then black could attack in the centre with c5 and then play a kind of Benoni. Slightly weird with the pawn here, but actually it's not great to have the pawn on g4 when black can open the position in this way. So Woodward played knight f3, so now we've got a more standard position, except that bishop is on e3 already. So Carlsen attacks it. Well, of course white wants to keep that beautiful dark square bishop, so bishop g5. And that's a provocative move. Goes all the way back to c1, but in some positions it's actually not great to have the pawn on h6. Carlsen finally puts a pawn in the middle. So if d5, then black is going to push forward at f5. So that's why white keeps the tension with castles. Now the knight isn't doing much on g4, so it comes back to f6. And bishop e3. Well, this is a tacit draw offer from Andy Woodward. Well, I think he realised that Carlsen was going to play for a win. He wasn't expecting him to go back to f6. And indeed, knight d7 played from Carlsen. Then h3. White doesn't have to play this move. And I think if I were Carlsen, I would have been very glad to see h3. And let's just come back here. White could, for example, play like this. And then push the knight back and bishop e3. And this is quite a reasonable way for white to play. You know, you set up queen c2, rook to d1, perhaps push forward with c5. Of course, black can play knight g takes e5. And yeah, that's going to be more complicated. But that's a reasonable way for white to play. But after h3 and the knight came back, now it's still possible to exchange here. But after bishop e3, I think Carlsen would have been delighted to see that in combination with h3. Because after this is a slightly funny combination. Now, I'm going to take you back to the game between Bluebaum and Sindarov from the Tata Steel Masters 2026. You might recall that. We had a similar structure. So knight c5. So Carlsen is basically just hitting this pawn as quickly as possible in order to force f3. So this is the same structure as Bluebaum Sindarov. That pawn would be better placed on h2 in this position because g3 is weakened, and also that pawn is a target. You remember Sindarov played an absolutely magnificent game. Beautiful attack. And taking on h3 was a very important part of that. And the g3 square was weakened. So this position, I mean, it's still very, very double-edged. But, well, knight h5 immediately looks at the g3 square. Queen d2 attacks this, and then g5. So Carlsen taking control over these dark squares. That is very, very dangerous. Now, white has a lovely space advantage. So that gives compensation, you could say. But there's no doubt about it. This king is... could be better placed. Could be more secure. Bishop e6. Attacking the pawn. b3. Now, this next move from Carlsen I think is very interesting indeed. I have to say my first thought would be to put the bishop on e5 and, you know, get more control here. But Carlsen, after almost 20 minutes thought, went for a4. It's a very interesting idea. We'll see how this works out in a second. Normally white would like to play b4 and push that knight back. But then this starts to get very messy. Something like this. And, you know, you're going to be able to take here. Very unclear position with this bishop raking across the board. And the king not very secure. Therefore, Woodward played bishop c2. So this pawn is secure. Again, bishop e5 is possible. But this is, look at Carlsen's strategy. He exchanges on b3 and then exchanges on a1. So what is this about? Normally, we're told never give away the open file. Well, watch this. Well, one thing is, so bishop e5, yeah, I mean, that's the kind of expected move, taking some control here. One thing is, if this rook returns to the middle, let's say rook d1, then, okay, queen f6, and then that rook would occupy the a file. And that is already quite difficult for white. You never know when it's going to slam on one of these squares. So that's tricky. So basically, this rook has to remain on the a file. Now, it doesn't want to stay on a1 with that bishop there. Therefore, rook a7 was played. c6, okay, that covers these important squares. And gives the queen the option to play to b6, looking at the rook and looking at here. So that's why, yeah, this one played. Well, that covers these squares. And Carlsen went in with knight f4. But it feels like I think it's very clever strategy, this whole action on the a file. Because it feels like white's position is a bit stretched now. You know, I would quite like to have that rook, let's say, back on f1 to cover here, or perhaps with the idea of rook f2 to cover on the king's side. But yeah, white's position looks stretched to me now. Bishop f2. Oh, by the way, if this is taken, Then queen b6, there we go. Attacking the rook, and yeah, there's some funny stuff going on here. I mean, it's not completely clear, but basically, you know, that's interesting for black. So bishop f2 played. Carlsen exchanged and played queen f6. So building up nicely, and we can see that this pawn is in the sights of the bishop and the queen is looking at f3. You know, it's one of those positions where I just would love to play that pawn back to h2. So what about b4? And then rook takes b7. Well, it's very tricky. Of course, c4 is vulnerable. That's one thing. But the knight hangs. But instead, rook a8 first. Now we can see how dangerous this rook is. Coming down to the second or the first rank. Very unpleasant for white in combination with these pieces. And if rook a7, exchanging off, okay, then black takes here. And I mean, it's still quite unclear, but I think white is under pressure there, basically. So once again, you can see how this A file can turn in white's favor, in black's favor. So bishop e3 played. Now Carlsen seized the moment. He took on h3. And this is highly unclear. I think to try and figure out what's going on here would be nigh on impossible when you're running short of time. But I think black already has two pawns. These pawns are vulnerable. The king is under fire from these pieces. Black certainly has enough compensation. Therefore, Woodward declined to take the bishop and just pushed the knight back. And then took on b7. So he just wasn't going to get involved. And the bishop dropped back. So what's happened with that little transaction? Well, material is still even. But there's one pawn less on the king's side. So the king is a little bit more insecure. And yeah, that's a little bit vulnerable. Now, in this position, Woodward played the knight to d4. Okay, so at this moment, where I'm going to have a drink from my lovely mug of tea, you're going to have a think, how do you play with black in this position? Black to play. See you in a moment. I've seen many chessboards in my life, but when I heard about this one, I was keen to see it for myself. It's beautiful. And completely wireless, thanks to an integrated battery and Bluetooth connection. For my edition, I wanted pieces that reflect clarity. When I play with them, everything feels natural. Just me, the board, and the game I love. This is my supreme chess set, the Daniel King edition. Knight d4 was inaccurate. Would have been better to keep that diagonal open, perhaps with bishop a4, in order to meet rook a8 with rook a7. So you can counter the rook on the a file. The problem is after knight d4, so that's the game move, Carlsen played a rook a8. So this is the move I've been going on about. So notice that with the bishop blocked, it's not possible to shut out the rook with rook a7. And this is very, very dangerous with this rook threatening to come down the a file. Okay, this happened. Knight takes, queen takes. What happens if rook a7 here? Is that possible now? No. This didn't happen because after the exchange, c5, and that bishop is dead. It's trapped. It's just not getting back into the game. For example, after this, just take here. And yeah, for example, bishop d4 check, you can see that black takes over these dark squares and mate follows shortly. I mean, this is a deadly attack. Let's go back. So Woodward played bishop d3 to cover the c-pawn, a check, and then knight f6. So all black's pieces are in play and the king is looking vulnerable. This knight looking to move over towards the king side. Whose king is more secure? Well, it's absolutely clear that Carlsen's king stands very well here. This king lacking cover, and with this rook attacking and the rest of black's pieces, there's trouble. Rook a7, well, begging for an exchange of rooks. Rook h1, no thank you very much. The rook swings over and Carlsen continues with knight h5, looking at these squares, and in fact he opens things up with g4. He wants to get his queen in on the attack. And simple threat to exchange and open up the second rank, and looking to get the queen in as well. The king is in desperate trouble. f4 played, trying to keep it closed, but no. Now it's possible just to take here, but Carlsen played instead rook a1. Protected by this beautiful bishop, of course. Now if queen b3, then you can take here and, well, for example, takes and knight g2. Black is how many pawns up? 2 pawns up. Completely safe king. White's king not looking good. This pawn and this pawn couldn't run down the board. Okay, so Woodward decided, right, I'm just going to give up my queen. He was probably very relieved that this dark squared bishop had actually disappeared from the board. But actually, this centre is really vulnerable, and likewise the king. Check, and knight e4. The e-pawn drops, in fact, and then f5. Well, that's where knights want to be, in the middle, supported, very well supported, and this is a winning position. The checks don't mean much because the king can always step up the board. b5 played, check, king g7 takes, queen d5. So looking at the rook, rook c8. Now here's a very cute move from Carlsen. He played knight f2. So opening up the queen's diagonal to the g-pawn, also threatening the bishop, and if that's taken, then queen takes g2, you get the piece back, and then the g-pawn runs. Very sweet. Rook c7, check. Bishop c4, check. And d5. And here, Woodward resigned. Well, I think an understandable decision. So let's just continue it a little bit. If bishop here, then check, and you take the bishop on e3. If, let me see, rook d7, okay, check, and that hits the b pawn and hits the bishop. And well, you can see that when white's pieces are all unprotected, all loose with the king open, it's very easy for the queen on the open board just to zip round and take more material. So that was the final position. Well, I think a fantastic game from Carlsen. He said afterwards, I had to go for it from the start. And he said when he played knight f4, he felt like he was really getting into the game. I mean, I would say I come back to this idea of playing a4. I think this is very clever. As I said, Black could very easily play bishop e5 and queen f6 and get some initiative like that. But I think this is such a clever idea to stretch the play. And it was so interesting that finally it was black that seized control on the a file, and once the rook came in, the attack was absolutely deadly. Brilliant game. Right, let's take a look at the standings after 6 rounds, if I can find them. Here we go. So in the lead, Arjun Erigaisi with 4.5. Now he defeated Zhu, so he's still in the lead, 4.5. Then Edomush and Carlsen on 4. Abdusattorov on 3.5. Now, crucial, last round pairings. Last round tomorrow. This tournament is a quick sprint. Erigaisi plays Woodward. That's pretty tough for Andy Woodward. So Erigaisi white against Woodward. Carlsen has white against Edomush. Now that's going to be fascinating. So Carlsen really rates Edomush. And this will be their first classical game against each other. Maybe their first game full stop. I don't think they've even played Blitz or Rapid. So that's going to be fascinating. The 14-year-old prodigy against Carlsen. And then we have Abdusattorov white against Van Foreest and Grandelius white against Zhu. So it's all to play for tomorrow. And, well, Carlsen said, at least I've given myself a chance. So it's going to be a fascinating last round. I'll report back. Thanks for watching.